From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A democratic revolt in Argentina, of all countries, as voters elect outsider and self-described libertarian economist Javier Milei as president. The 53-year-old congressman and former teacher defeated the candidate of the incumbent socialist government, Sergio Massa, in a landslide, 56% to 44%. What does this mean for politics, not only in that country, but in the rest of the Americas, and for the future of free markets in the Western Hemisphere? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal. Today with Mary O'Grady, author of the journal's America's column, and Kim Strassel, a PW regular and also a columnist for the Journal. First, let's dig into the actual results, Mary. The magnitude of the victory shocked a lot of people who thought Milei might be too radical in his views and ambitions for Argentina, especially after he'd finished second to Massa in the previous round of voting. But in the runoff, he was able to consolidate the center-right vote and the disgruntled middle class. Were you surprised by the magnitude of that victory?
I was a little surprised, although I have to say that the polls have been terrible, both in the primary and in the first round. So it was very hard to anticipate what would happen. I think the thing that surprised me was obviously a lot of people who did not want Milei to be president preferred him over the incumbent economy minister. And that's what really made the difference. I mean, this was not as much a vote for Milei as it was a repudiation of this left-wing populism that the current government stands for.
How bad are things in Argentina right now economically? You kind of go through the list and makes the U.S. look good. How bad are they?
Well, they're really bad, but what's amazing is they're probably going to get much worse before they get better. One of the problems is that central bank has just been aggressively printing money. So they have an inflation problem. Anticipated inflation by the end of the year is expected to be about 180%, but that's at current levels. I mean, no one wants to hold pesos. And as you know, when no one wants to hold pesos and they're still printing a lot, the value of them drops by a lot. So the inflation problem is very bad, but there's also a lot of problem with just the general economic climate because this government and Cristina Kirchner, who's the vice president, has spent so many years violating the rule of law, harming investors. So nobody wants to put money in Argentina. And that's also a problem because it means the economy doesn't grow. There's no supply side solution to an inflationary problem.
Kim, as you're watching this election, what's really interesting to me is the degree to which the people who were opposed to Milei were warning that he's a crazy radical, that he is a Trump-like figure, Donald Trump-like figure. And even suggestions from some of the folks in the rest of Latin America, left-leaning governments, that somehow this was going to be a return of fascism. They really try this with every single center right-wing candidate like this. Dan Henninger pointed out on an earlier call that we had that in the New York Times lead sentence, they managed to get right or hard right in the lead.
Far right in the headline.
3 times in the lead graph. So you know where they're coming from. But is that really a fair assessment?
Not at all. And I think it would be really fascinating to have Javier Milei comment on that description of himself. Look, he campaigned as a libertarian. Actually, he calls himself a liberal libertarian, and liberal, of course, in the more the European sense of the word, meaning smaller government, less government control. And what the American press is focused very much on are some of those libertarian policies that they don't like and so describe as far right. You know, he describes himself as anti-abortion, although, of course, under the libertarian view that the unborn have liberties. He believes in choice in education. He's called, for instance, for drug decriminalization and fewer regulations on guns. He hates identity politics. All of this is inspiring some on the left in the United States media to call him a fascist and somehow lump him with Donald Trump, which is very odd in some ways, too, because there are big distinctions between Milei and Donald Trump, one of them being that a main plank of what he has run on in Argentina is far more open trade, in particular with capitalist nations like the United States. This is different, obviously, from Donald Trump, who's much more of a trade protectionist. But I think the thing that I find strange about these stories is for as much as they are pushing all of this, these stances that he has on a lot of these more social or cultural issues aren't going to matter that much if he isn't able to deal with the economic problems that Mary has mentioned. And in that regard, he's very much a libertarian. He's calling for a vast reduction of the size of government, much less government spending, fewer regulations. He wants to abolish the federal bank. This is not a guy that is about building up centralized power, quite the opposite. And while I might cheer many of those policies, it's going to be a very difficult thing to do in Argentina, just given the big mess that they've got themselves into so far.
Mary, no question that the voters who are rejecting the policies of the previous government, Sergio Massa was the economy minister of many of those policies. Essentially, they were socialist, right? They believed in the commanding powers of the state, out of control spending monetized by the central bank, which of course produces inflation, but also a kind of corporatist state linkage to certain kind of businesses. Any doubt that that's what the voters were rejecting, the results of those policies?
Well, they were rejecting the results of those policies. I don't know how many voters were really diving into the economics of corporatism. Christina Kirchner had nationalized a lot of businesses, including the airline, which of course was nationalized back in the 80s in the lost decade, and then had been privatized, and she grabbed it back again. Those are the kinds of things that just don't work. They don't make a country competitive. And when you pile on top of that very punishing export taxes on the only competitive sector that Argentina really has, which is the agricultural sector, it just makes it very tough for the country to grow fast, which is what they need. People were rejecting that. I don't think that a lot of people were voting for Milei, though. I think there was a lot of holding noses and pulling levers because he, had a stable sort of 30% of the vote. But beyond that, the rest that he got was really coming from people, as I said before, who just couldn't bear to go on with this government again, both for reasons of economics and also corruption, the surveillance of enemies, the way they abuse the power of the state. All of that has become really repulsive to many Argentines who want to live in a much freer country.
And if this wasn't a vote for Milei, was a whole, at least not a majority, then part of that might have been because of his manner. His comments tend to be sometimes insulting, outrageous. In that sense, he's not unlike Trump. And he also has some policies that are fairly radical. Let's dig into the central bank question and the dollarized economy that he was talking about. He said on central banks, they are divided into 4 categories. The bad ones, like the Federal Reserve, the very bad ones, like the ones in Latin America, the horribly bad ones, and the Central Bank of Argentina, which is, I guess, down at the bottom of the list. He's called Mary for the elimination of the central bank, but there's no real details about what would take its place. There is, I guess, a relationship between that pledge and what he calls his ambition to dollarize the economy, which is replacing the Argentine peso with the dollar as the currency of choice. And I guess if you did that, that would mean you're basically subcontracting your monetary policy to another central bank, that is the Federal Reserve.
Right. And I think when I started writing about him a year or so ago, I started looking around at the neighbors and their inflation rates. And Argentina stands out. I mean, most other countries that ran into an inflation problem when the Fed here started printing money and causing inflation, they were dealing with 7, 9, 6% inflation. And then bam, you look at Argentina and it's over 100% and rising. So I think that there's a general sense in Argentina of despair about the bank. It's not like it made a mistake once and then it sort of reined things back in. This is a habitual problem for almost like 100 years. So people are very much looking for solutions. Now, one of the problems is that the rate at which you dollarize is going to have an effect on people. And one of the concerns is that the peso is going to have to get a lot weaker in order for him to find a rate that the country can dollarize on and back up its liabilities. So that's what I mean when I say that things could get a lot worse before they get better.
How does the peso get weaker? It's lost 90% of its value against the dollar from the stories I've read.
Right. But as soon as you say you're going to dollarize, right, then you have to start thinking about the obligations that the central bank has to the banks because you don't want to cause a banking failure. And in order to clean that problem up, you might have to dollarize at a much higher rate. Remember in Ecuador in 2000 when they dollarized, the Ecuadorian sucre was trading around 17,000 and they ended up having to dollarize at 25,000. And a lot of people were sore and the president lost his job like a week later. But dollarization has been very good for Ecuador. Some people say Argentina is too big a country to do that, but I'm not sure I believe that. I think that it could be done. It's just the devil is in the details, and we don't have a lot of details about how they intend to deal with some of these problems that I'm describing.